The New York Times is horrifically wrong on Israel year after year, and 2023 was no exception. Everything important about Israel, well, they just got it backwards. I've looked over the last year, and there's an article out now about the New York Times on their coverage of the Israeli-Gaza conflict. It's astounding how much the Gray Lady, as they used to call the New York Times, has gotten wrong on the coverage of Israel. They are horrifically anti-Semitic. They are horrifically anti-Zionist and horrifically anti-Israel. Immediately after the massacre on October 7th, the headline they ran was not the massacre. The headline was not about the massacre. It said Gaza has suffered under a 16-year blockade, even though the vast majority of all the supplies going into Gaza over the last decade have come through Israel, not through Egypt. Egypt doesn't want them to have anything. Israel allows in the supplies and gives them water, sewer coverage, electricity for free.
Right, right. I would add, however, though, that on the Egyptian side of the border, there is a strip of land that lies between Egypt, the Sinai Desert, and Gaza. It's called the Philadelphia Corridor.
Corridor.
And the Egyptian government has permitted tunnels under it to be used, and they have not been destroyed. So a lot of the weapons, the munitions, the artillery rounds, the all of these missiles and rockets and components have come through across the Philadelphia corridor because it's not been shut down. So it's in no way a sealed region or with any kind of a complete blockade. And the only blockade was to keep out the weapons. And I've actually been to the personally, I've been to the crossing points like Horem Shalom, for example, and watch the truckloads of supplies with flour bags and cement bags for the tunnels, of course, passing through.
I've been there myself, and there's a cement plant that Israel built for Gaza right on the border. They make
Mm-hmm.
the cement, they truck it right in. That cement was paid for by the EU. It was supposed to build hospitals, schools, and housing, and 99% of it, according
Mm-hmm.
to intelligence in Israel, was spent underground building these massive terror tunnels. And that's why above ground doesn't look so good, but below ground, that's where the billions were spent. But the New York Times goes on and on and on. The biggest screw up they had in the past year was the bombing of the hospital in Gaza, that even after intelligence agencies from almost every country in the world proved without a shadow of a doubt it was Hamas or Islamic Jihad rockets that hit the parking lot, not even the hospital.
Right.
The New York Times printed the press release from the Hamas Politburo saying hundreds killed, babies, doctors, patients, when the hospital was never even hit. A missile hit
Right.
the parking lot and it's shown on camera where it came from. Israel had nothing to do with it, according to every intelligence agency in the world. The New York Times has never walked back that story, ever, to this minute. They're still talking about it. It's as if the New York Times doesn't want there to be a state of Israel. Am I reading that correctly?
It seems so to me. I mean, remember that. I mean, the New York Times has a long record of this kind of reporting. Think back to the time of the Holodomor, the starvation of the Ukrainian kulaks back in 1932-33, the winter under Stalin. And what did the New York Times print? Because Walter Duranty, the New York Times correspondent, was stationed in Moscow. Nothing to see here. Everything's fine. Nobody's starving. This record of the New York Times goes back a long, long way.
That's the same New York Times that a few years later said there was no Holocaust going on. There were
The same.
deportations, but no death camps. And that had a lot to do with affecting American foreign policy to leave the concentration camps alone. They have been on the wrong side of the truth for a very, very long time. And it strikes
Yes, they
me as
have.
so bizarre that people will say, "Did you see the Times? They gave a good review to this play," or they have a great food section, or look at their travel section, and on and on and on, disregarding the fact that they're wrong on the news most of the time.
And don't forget how they actually forced the resignation of an editorial page editor because that editor permitted an op-ed column by Senator Tom Cotton to be printed there. Remember that?
Because Tom Cotton is Republican.
Oops.